Hi class, this week we'll be talking about Neanderthal, archaic Homo sapiens, and Homo floresiensis. So one of the big hints this week is that Neanderthal has some different cranial morphology. And that first is that they have actually occipital buns. So that's the highlighted area in this picture here. In Homo sapiens, if you kind of touch the back of your skull where your spine meets, kind of the soft part, and then you hit this bump in the back of your skull. In Homo sapiens, it's called an occipital protuberance. In Neanderthals, it's more rounded and larger. And again, aside from Neanderthals having a larger cranial capacity, this occipital bun is one of those major features. So in terms of archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthal, they're going to emerge around the same time. One of the things that we do know is that Neanderthal fossils, purebred Neanderthal fossils, are only found in Europe and Asia, Western Asia. So again, they would have evolved from the Homo erectus that were in that region. And so then you have Homo erectus up in that area probably 1 million years ago. And then they diverged. There's a divergence into creating Neanderthal, and that was through isolation, genetic drift, and some of those other things. But we also have archaic Homo sapiens in Africa kind of at this time are also going to evolve. Earliest modern humans, we're looking at 200,000 years ago. I think they backed that up to about 250, possibly all the way back to 300,000 years ago. Some sites actually have a mixture of archaic and modern traits. So it's very interesting in terms of looking at breeding populations. Archaic Homo sapiens would have also had more pronounced kind of brow ridges and some of those other, I don't want to use the term primitive, but older versions of, the human evolution in terms of dietary plasticity and some of those other things. So the two big hypotheses that you will definitely want to know going forward, these are also big hints, is, again, this is related to Charles Darwin's idea, but out of Africa hypothesis is that modern Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa and then spread to Asia and Europe, replacing the indigenous archaic Homo sapiens. Now, this is the key part here, is that essentially we were this one unified group that then spread out and took over the niches that were in Europe and Asia, and then eventually to the New World. It promotes the idea of a single origin of modern human species. So keep that in mind when I talk about multi-regional. So the multi-regional continuity is the idea that Homo erectus spreads out, goes into Europe and Africa, out of Africa, goes into Europe and Asia, and essentially evolves separately into what we would call our modern day races. Now, remember, this is major problematic, right? The idea here is that Europeans would have evolved kind of out of this Neanderthal structure. And then you have Asians would have evolved out of Homo erectus being in Asia 1 million years ago, developing along the same continuity. And the pinnacle would be Homo sapiens, right? So essentially, no matter what, Homo erectus was going to evolve into Homo sapiens. Now, multi-regional is problematic because it becomes kind of a racial tendency, which is an interesting kind of aside. And these two debates, the out of Africa, that Homo sapiens are only coming out of Africa and then replacing the groups that were there, versus multi-regional, which is Homo erectus gets out of Africa and then evolves separately into these different groups that then create this pinnacle of Homo sapiens. There's a little bit of, again, multi-regional promotes gene flow, which is probably something that we can see when we get more recent genetic evidence and fossil evidence that essentially interbreeding with these different groups is a key component to multi-regionality. Now, in terms of the evidence, right, I already mentioned that archaic Homo sapiens evolved out of Homo erectus at 500,000 years ago in Africa. Now, the archaic Homo in Africa at 350,000 to 250,000, we have actually sites there. And these are kind of the sites that have have really given us some evidence about archaic Homo sapiens and where they're found, right? Now, the idea here is that archaic Homo sapiens are found in these locations, but again, the out of Africa theorists would say that, yeah, they're found there, but they essentially came out of Africa. They didn't evolve out of Homo erectus, right? They are coming out of Africa. So multi-regional people would say, no, they're developing out of Homo erectus in these different locations, and then they're turning into modern Homo sapiens. And then the out of Africa folk would say, no, archaic Homo sapiens all evolved out of Africa and then moved into these regions. So we have, again, two different kind of competing. What I want to get to before I get into the dietary adaptations is that really what we have with new genetic evidence, and you'll see this in the videos and the readings, is that it's much more complicated than that. What it looks like happened was that all of these groups, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, developing out of Homo erectus, Denisovians is another group that they found kind of in Siberia, are essentially all interbreeding. And modern day Homo sapiens are not outside of that. Essentially, they also interbred with Neanderthal and Denisovians, and most likely they interbred with some later versions of Homo erectus and even archaic Homo sapiens. So again, in those sites that we see genetic diversity, essentially what we're seeing is interbreeding. Now, we have genetic evidence, and I'll probably get to this later on the slide, but it's good to just kind of review it. We have genetic evidence that, and the most recent genetic evidence is that we have all human species, modern day Homo sapiens, have some Neanderthal blood. Now, they used to think that pure-blooded African folk or people from Africa would not have had Neanderthal blood because they were only in Europe. Now what we've discovered is actually there was a fair amount of migration and interbreeding going on, that there was enough gene flow that essentially going back and forth that all human species have some Neanderthal blood, and most of us, as far as we know, have some Denisovian blood as well. So what that means in the early 2000s, when I went to school, the jury was still out on this. But now that we've done the whole genome sequencing of Denisovians and Neanderthal, what we've discovered is that essentially, and human species and Homo sapiens, is that we have Homo neanderthalensis blood in us. Approximately 2%. Most Homo sapiens have 2% Neanderthal blood. So again, Neanderthals are not dead. They're not extinct as pure-blooded relatives. They are, but they're all living inside of us in terms of our biology. So again, there was gene flow, right? There was interbreeding among all of these groups. So the part of multi-regional that had that gene flow component, where there was admixture and interbreeding between these different groups, was correct. So it's much more complicated. What it looks like is that, yes, when we trace our ancestry back, it all comes back from one group in, I think, South Sudan. And we've kind of done this through mitochondrial DNA. Now, if you want to do some research, mitochondrial DNA versus Y chromosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA is only passed through the mother, Y chromosomal is passed through the father. So there's some discrepancies and some debates within the field here. But in terms of mitochondrial DNA, they can trace it all the way back to this group in South Sudan about 250,000 years ago. And then that out of Africa theory looks correct. Now, the issue is that the interbreeding part is what happens is when modern Homo sapiens leave, essentially they start interbreeding with these other groups that then creates this diversity piece. So it's not necessarily cut and dry out of Africa and multi-regional. It's more of a combination of those things. So I think that will help in terms of kind of getting to the larger pictures of what this all means, right? And remember, in the field, there's a lot of times there's these debates of extremes. And then what really comes together and what happens is everything, instead of being black and white kind of boxes, categories, people end up just throwing everything in the gray zone, which is essentially it's much more complicated than that. But that minutia of complexity is really what biological anthropologists are after currently. In terms of dietary adaptations, archaic Homo sapiens had similar tools to that of Homo erectus. So your large stone tools, hand axes, and those kinds of things. The teeth and jaws essentially shrink with more and more tool use. Back molars start to shrink. Incisors and canines are worn more. And incisors and canines are worn more, I will tell you, is because they're using their teeth as tools. So many times, groups, especially as we move kind of closer to us in terms of the timeline, Homo sapiens especially are using their front teeth to hold things as tools. Now, again, two hands are great, but in terms of like weaving and producing things, using your mouth as kind of this third hand becomes very important, and we start to see this teeth or tooth wear during this time period. And again, changes in archaic Homo sapiens are regional. So this has a lot to do with what we would call environmental determinism, right? Depending on where you live, whether it be colder, warmer, whatever that looks like, archaic Homo sapiens in colder climates probably maintained more of their body hair. They probably had larger nasal capacity in order to warm air coming in from cold climates. So again, they're going to look different in different locations. Height, body size, all of those things will also shift based on the environment. Neanderthals, again, these are the kind of clusters of areas that we find Neanderthal. They had larger brains, occipital buns, bigger, larger brow ridges. And then they had lessened chin, so a smaller chin. Larger nasal capacity, I just talked about that, cold adaptive. They have intraorbital foramen, which is basically holes in our faces where veins come to our face. So there's holes in our mandible and the area of our sinuses, so that essentially the veins are coming through the bone to heat our face, our skin that is covering our cranium and jaws. And essentially these are larger in Neanderthal to warm the outer skin portion of the body. And this helps with cold adaptation. They had shorter tibias relative to their femurs. So they were actually shorter than us. They were bigger, stockier, and again, more muscular. And this is the key component here, is they definitely had larger craniums by a lot. And again, so if you go by brain size comparison to body size, Neanderthal to us, if that equals smarts, would have also been smarter than us, or more intelligent, as they say. What we've found with brain size is that it doesn't necessarily correlate completely with intelligence. And so there's some interesting kind of debates in the field around that as well. Malstrian is the type of stone tools that Neanderthal and archaic Homo sapiens used. So Malstrian is also a hint here. Let's see. So Neanderthal in the middle Paleolithic, 300,000 to 30,000. By the way, 30,000 years ago is essentially when we find the last pure-blooded Neanderthal. And this would have been the middle part of the Old Stone Age. Levalos is the method of stone tool production used during the middle Paleolithic, in which the core was prepared and flakes removed before removing the final tool from the core. So the difference here in terms of stone tool technology is that back in the day when Homo erectus and even Homo habilis were making tools, the core, or the key material that they were using, would have become the tool. Now, in the Levalos time period, essentially the core isn't essential, but once you knock off a giant flake, that becomes a smaller stone tool. So now they're starting to use what would have used to be waste flakes as tools themselves. Okay. Let's see. Calculus is the hardened plaque on teeth. And so minerals and saliva being deposited on teeth. This is a newer technology, but what we're getting out of this is essentially being able to figure out what they ate, their diet. And what we have found is that Neanderthal ate plants. They used plants as medicine, and they ate plenty of animal meat, red meat. Now, there's some theories in the field that essentially Neanderthal did not utilize seafood. And didn't utilize shellfish. So they had some food taboos around those products and really, really loved red meat. So we know that. They buried their dead in a flexed fetal position. So we know that they had honoring of the dead. There's also grave goods. They used symbols, body ornaments, shells 10,000 years before the arrival of modern humans. They had all of these things. They were highly physically active, and they had art sooner than archaic Homo sapiens as well. So they're highly intelligent, and I think we need to remember that for sure.